A Tale of Two Schools. In the early 1900s, Mexican Americans, or Chicanos, in California and the Southwest were excluded from whites-only theaters, parks, swimming pools, restaurants, and even schools. Immigration from Mexico waged many battles against such discriminatory treatment, often risking their jobs in fields and factories and enduring threats of deportation. In 1945, one couple in California won a significant victory in their struggle to secure the best education for thousands of Chicano children. In the fall of 1944, Soledad Viduri took her children and those of her brother Gonzalo Mendez to enroll at the 17th Street School in Westminster, California. Although they were cousins and shared a Mexican heritage, the Mendez and the Viduri children looked quite different. Sylvia, Gonzalo Jr., and Geronimo Mendez had dark skin, hair, and eyes, while Alice and Virginia Viduri had fair complexions and features. An administrator looked the five children over. Alice and Virginia could stay, he said, but their dark-skinned cousins would have to register at the Hoover School, the town's Mexican school, located a few blocks away. Furious at such blatant discrimination, Viduri returned home without registering any of the children in either school. In the 1940s, Westminster was a small farming community in the southern part of the state. Lush citrus groves, lima bean fields, sugar beet farms stretched in every direction from a modest downtown business district. Most of the men and women working in those fields were first and second generation immigrants from Mexico who were employed by white ranchers. Like many California towns at the time, Westminster really comprised two separate worlds, one Anglo and one Mexican. While Anglo growers welcomed Chicano workers in their fields during the times of economic prosperity, they shut them out of mainstream society. Most people of Mexican ancestry lived in colonias, segregated residential communities on the fringes of the Anglo neighborhoods. The housing was often substandard with inadequate plumbing and often no heating. Roads were normally unpaved and dusty. Westminster's Hoover School was in the heart of one such colonia and was attended by the children of Mexican field laborers. A small frame building at the edge of a muddy cow pasture, the Hoover School stood in stark contrast to the sleek 17th Street School with its handsome green lawns and playing fields. The Westminster School District was not alone in discriminating against Chicano students. At the time, more than 80% of the school's districts in California with large Mexican populations practiced segregation. The segregation of Chicano children was also widespread in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The Mexican schools were typically housed in rundown buildings. They employed less experienced teachers than the Anglo schools. Chicano children were given shabbier books and equipment than their white peers and were taught in more crowded classrooms. Perhaps the greatest difference between the schools, however, was in their curricula. While geometry and biology were taught at the Anglo schools, classes at the Mexican schools focused on teaching boys industrial skills and girls domestic tasks. Most Anglo educators did not expect or encourage Chicano students to advance beyond the 8th grade. Instead, the curriculum at the Mexican schools was designed, as one district superintendent put it, to help these children take their place in society. That place was the lowest rung of the economic ladder, providing cheap, flexible labor from the prospering agricultural communities of California and the Southwest. At the time, more than 80% of the agricultural labor force in Southern California was Mexican. An advanced education would only make Mexican Americans dissatisfied with farm labor, some white educators reasoned. As one school superintendent in Texas told his fellow educators, "You have doubtless heard that ignorance is bliss. It seems that this is so when one has to transplant onions. If a man has very much sense or education, either he's not going to stick to this kind of work. So you see, it is up to the white population to keep the Mexican on his knees in an onion patch." But Chicano men and women had different ideas about their children's future. Like other immigrant groups, Chicano field laborers believed education was the ticket to a better life in America, a way out of the heat and dust of the fields. Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez knew well the difficult life of field laborers. Both had emigrated to the United States as young children. Like thousands of Mexicans in the early 20th century, Gonzalo's family fled political turmoil in their native country. They had left behind a successful ranch in Chihuahua and found jobs as day laborers in the citrus groves of Southern California. Felicitas Gomez emigrated to America from Juncos, Puerto Rico when she was 10. The Gomez family led a migrant life, following the harvest from Texas to Arizona to California. Eventually, they settled in Southern California, where the Mendezes lived, and in 1936, Felicitas and Gonzalo married. By that time, Gonzalo had a reputation in the county as a champion orange picker, and he commanded a slightly higher wage than other field workers. Felicitas, thrifty and resourceful, saved what she could from Gonzalo's wages, and in a few years the couple were able to lease a ranch of their own, 40 acres of asparagus in the town of Westminster. The Mendezes were among the few Chicano tenant farmers in Orange County. Most Latinos at the time held low-paying jobs as field workers. Employment opportunities for Mexican Americans were severely limited. Discrimination prevented them from getting jobs in restaurants, department stores, and even many factories, making it extremely difficult for them to advance economically. Both Felicitas and Gonzalo were forced to abandon their education in grade school in order to support their families. But they had higher hopes for young Sylvia, Gonzalo Jr., and Geronimo. When Soledad Viduri and her brother and sister-in-law's children were refused admission to the 17th Street School because they, unlike her own children, didn't look white enough, Gonzalo and Felicitas were outraged. How could it be possible, they wondered? They were American citizens. Gonzalo was naturalized just a few years before, and because Felicitas was born in a U.S. territory, she was a citizen by birth. Both thought of themselves as Americans and told their children that they were Americans. For people of Mexican descent living in California and the Southwest, however, discrimination was part of the social landscape. Many parks, hotels, dance halls, stores, eateries, and barbershops were off limits. Mexican Americans were forced to sit in a movie theater balconies. In many communities, they were only permitted to swim 1 day a week at the public pool, just before it was cleaned and drained. The fact that the Mendezes were fairly prosperous tenant farmers did not make them any more acceptable to the Main Street community. They were used to being told in restaurants, "We don't serve Mexicans here," and being informed by store clerks that they would have to wait to make their purchases until all of the white customers had been served. "That's when you learn to walk away," Felicitas later remembered it. But this time, Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez didn't plan to walk away. They were ready to do battle with the Westminster School District for the sake of their children's education. Realizing other Chicano families in the community faced the same problem, the Mendezes organized a group of Mexican parents to protest the segregation of their children in the shabbier school. Together, they sent a letter to the Board of Education demanding that the schools be integrated. Their request was flatly denied. Gonzalo continued to petition the school district administrators. Worn down by his persistence, the school superintendent finally agreed to make an exception for the Mendez children and admit them to the Anglo school. But the Mendezes immediately rejected his offer. The school would have to admit all of the Chicano children in the community or none of them. The Mendezes hired a civil rights attorney, David Marcus, who had recently won a lawsuit on behalf of Mexican Americans in nearby San Bernardino by seeking to integrate the public parks and schools. The Mendezes also learned parents in other school districts were fighting segregation too. Marcus suggested they join forces, and on March 2, 1945, the Mendezes and 4 other Mexican American families filed a class action suit against the Westminster, Garden Grove, El Moderna, and Santa Ana boards of education on behalf of 5,000 Mexican American children attending inferior segregated schools. The Mendezes threw themselves into the trial preparations. Gonzalo took a year off of work to organize Latino men and women and gather evidence for their case. Every day, he and David Marcus drove across Orange County's patchwork of vegetable farms and citrus groves, stopping in the colonias. They knocked on doors and tried to convince Mexican American parents and their children to testify in court. It was no easy task. Some workers feared their Anglo bosses might fire them if they testified, or worse, they might be deported. But slowly the plaintiffs built their case. Gonzalo offered to pay the transportation costs and lost wages of anyone willing to travel to Los Angeles to appear in the court during the trial. Meanwhile, Felicitas took over the daily operation of the farm. In the little spare time she had, she organized a group of local Latino parents to support the 5 plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Finally, the trial date arrived. Now it was up to the courts to decide if the Latino men and women who helped California's agricultural economy grow and thrive were entitled to the same rights as those who prospered from their labor. During the trial, defense attorney Joel Ogle pointed out the 1896 Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson that gave legal sanction to racial segregation, provided the separate facilities for different races were equal. Furthermore, Ogle maintained that there were sound educational and social advantages to segregated schooling. The Mexican schools gave special instruction to students who didn't speak English and who were unfamiliar with American values and customs. Such Americanization programs benefited both Anglos and Mexicans, Ogle argued. But this education rationalization for segregation was undermined by the testimony of 9-year-old Sylvia, 8-year-old Gonzalo, and 7-year-old Geronimo Mendez. All spoke fluent English, as did many of the other children who attended the Hoover School. In fact, further testimony revealed no language proficiency tests were ever given to Chicano students. Rather, enrollment decisions were based entirely on the last names and skin color, as evidenced by the experience of the Mendez children and their cousins. The racist underpinnings of such Americanization programs became apparent when James L. Kent, the superintendent of the Garden Grove School District, took the stand. Under oath, Kent said he believed the people of Mexican descent were intellectually, culturally, and morally inferior to European Americans. Even if a Latino child had the same academic qualifications as a white child, Kent stated, he would never allow the Latino child to enroll in an all-Anglos school. The testimony made the Latino men and women gathered in the courtroom to show their support for the suit wince in pain and anger. Felicitas said later that she never forgot Kent's hate-laced testimony. He said Mexicans should be segregated like pigs in pig pens, she recalled. He said Mexicans were filthy and had lice and all kinds of diseases. U.S. District Court Judge Paul J. McCormick was also appalled by Kent's blatant bigotry. On February 18, 1946, he ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. In his opinion, McCormick pointed out segregation fosters antagonisms in the children and suggests inferiority among them where none exists. Because the separate schools created social inequality, he reasoned, they were in violation of the students' constitutional rights. He also pointed out that there was no sound educational basis for the segregation of Anglo and Mexican students, since research showed segregation worked against language acquisition and cultural assimilation. The Orange County School Boards filed an appeal. But dramatic social change was occurring on a national level following World War II, and Orange County school officials would find their position on segregation coming under increasing attack. After fighting for democracy abroad, Mexican American soldiers balked against the rigid lines of division when they returned home. How could America declare itself the leader of the free world while it trampled the rights of its own citizens, they asked. Latino veterans formed civil rights groups and demanded change around the country. Other minority groups were waging similar battles. By now, the Mendez lawsuit was drawing national attention. Civil rights leaders in other states were watching the proceedings closely. For half a century, they had been trying to strike down the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, and they thought Mendez just might be the test case to do it. Among those following the suit was an African-American attorney named Thurgood Marshall. Marshall and 2 of his colleagues from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, submitted an amicus curiae, Friends of the Court brief in the appellate case. Among the other groups submitting amicus briefs were the League of the United Latin American Citizens, the Japanese American Citizens League, and the Jewish Congress. By April 14, 1947, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco upheld the lower court decision. The court stopped short, however, of condemning the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. The NAACP and other groups eagerly waited for Orange County school officials to file an appeal that would bring the case before the U.S. Supreme Court. But But lawyers for the school read the writing on the wall. Mainstream public opinion had shifted,